Hi everyone, this is Athena here, and today I wanted to go over briefly what you need to consider when defining a thesis if you haven't had much experience with crafting thesis statements, or if maybe you're just not sure really how to refine one or get the most appropriate sort of focal point for your essay. Then this tutorial should help you with that. So let's get into our discussion of thesis statements. Okay, so the first question we have to ask: how do we generate a thesis? Okay. The first thing I tell my students to do is to determine the type of assignment. You can see here there are different types of assignments that one might write. And I kind of give examples from the class that I normally teach at Penn State, but I have 4 different types of assignments that one might write. We have an analysis or an analytical essay. Remember that when you're analyzing something, you are taking it, breaking it down into its component pieces, just dissecting it, trying to understand it better. There's also an expository essay. This is simply providing information or explaining how something works, what something is, etc. So you could define something, explain a process, etc. Argumentative essays would be the next type of essay that you might potentially write. In an argumentative essay, of course, you're going to argue for some type of point or make a claim, and then you're going to work to defend that claim. It's a little bit different from the other types of essays that I've mentioned so far, because you have this persuasive goal and you need to work to show all points of view, depending on whatever your issue is, and refute points of view that maybe don't align with your own particular point of view. Lastly, we have narrative writing. So this is when you're telling stories. I have my students write personal narratives, so they will kind of tell a story from their own lives to reveal something that they've learned or to learn something further about themselves. So these are the different types of assignments you could be writing. Of course, your thesis will be vastly different for each one. Let's go on. Now, this is kind of the key. This is the key to understanding, or creating rather, a thesis statement. You have to have a topic and a controlling idea. And this is the way that I communicate this to my students, because I think this makes the most sense. So we know that a thesis should contain a topic. When we pick a subject to write about, whether we're given it or not, we have a topic. There's a subject that we're going to write about. What students oftentimes miss is the controlling idea. And when I'm talking about a controlling idea, what I'm talking about is the thing that you as the writer is trying to say about the subject. All right, so let me give you an example of a sort of complex thesis statement that I came up with, and I'm going to break it down and show you how to identify the subject and how to identify the controlling idea. So here's my little mock thesis. Because preschool programming has such a profound impact on educational and social development on kindergarten-bound children, state educational requirements should be revised in order to make it a necessary component of the public education system. Okay, that might have been a lot to take in all at once, but let's break that down. So what am I ultimately doing? Okay, well, if I were to summarize this, put it in layman's terms, I'm attempting to argue that because preschool is so important to a young child's development, it helps them to be ready for kindergarten, that maybe we should make it a requirement of the state. Okay, so let's break this down into the subject and controlling idea equation. What is my subject? Well, we could label my subject as preschool. All right, anyone could write an essay on preschool. If I said write an essay on preschool, you might say something entirely different. You might talk about pedagogical methods. You might talk about child psychology. You might talk about class size. I don't know. There are so many different things we could say about preschool, but my controlling idea, the specific thing that I'm trying to say in this mock thesis, is that preschool is really beneficial, and because it's so beneficial, we should make it mandatory. That's what I'm doing. I have this big subject, preschool, and my own unique perspective, my own point of view is I'm going to steer this large subject, preschool, in this one specific direction, hence my controlling idea. Let's go on. We're not going to have you do this because obviously you're not in my class and you didn't write an analysis, but we'll keep going. So here are some different ways that, if you have a thesis, because the thing that I see most often is that students start with a thesis, but it's kind of broad. It might be a little bit shapeless. It might be trying to bite off more than, the student can chew. So how do we whittle this down? How do we get it specific as possible? Because the one thing I tell every student is strive for specificity. The more specific you can be, the better your topic. So In my experience, in my opinion, some of the best theses start as questions. All right, so for example, maybe you are really interested in the GMO food movement and you have this question: is GMO food actually bad for you, or is it just a lot of hype? You don't know, but it's a good question. It's worthy of research. So you'll see that's a nice place to begin. It's something that interests you, and that's what we want. You know, as an instructor, I want my students to care about what they're writing and to be intrigued by it. And I find, and a lot of my students will agree, if you start with a question, something that is honestly an interest of yours that you're not sure of, you're going to have more fruitful research, and you're going to wind up with a better thesis statement because that question will kind of guide you in a positive direction. But let's continue. Of course, you don't want your thesis statement to be either too general or too specific to be sustained by your evidence. So if it's too general, you know, you might find if you're writing, let's say, a 5-page essay, if we'll go back to the previous example, if I'm going to write about GMO food and I'm just trying to give all this different information, the history, what it is, why it's dangerous, I'm going to be just kind of doing a sweeping overview because that's a lot of different areas under the larger umbrella of GMO food to tackle. I'm not, as a writer, going to be able to say anything really specific or get too much into detail because I'm going to be trying to hit on so many areas. So, you know, in that situation, that might be where it's necessary to zoom in a little bit, get a little bit closer to the topic. On the flip side, I have had this happen. This happens not often, but some students run into another problem where they select a topic and it's so focused that there's really no information that they can research. So, for example, I had many years ago a student who wanted to write about hydraulic fracturing in the area where she lived. And at the time, hydraulic fracturing was really new to the area. So she was looking for articles that would tell her, you know, okay, here is the situation where you live, here's how predominant it is, here are the situations that homeowners are running into, problems, praises, whatever. She couldn't find anything. There wasn't any published information about her area. So what did she do? She took a step back, okay? So instead of looking at the hometown where she grew up, she expanded her, you know, her focal point to Western Pennsylvania to encompass a much larger region that did have some published evidence. And when she did that, she was able to find the information, okay? So you'll notice that I talk about having to refocus if necessary and thinking of this binocular analogy, finding the appropriate, you know, focal point for your thesis is just like using binoculars. You want to get as close as you can, but if you get a little bit too close and you can't find the information needed, you just back it up. So just think about things a little more broadly. Let's go on. I'm going to give you another sample idea for maybe a thesis. So here's a not great thesis. People eat food that isn't healthy. All right, that's not very specific. Readers probably understand that, yeah, there are people that eat food that isn't healthy, and what on earth are you going to say? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you could cover in such a broad topic. So I'm going to recommend that you limit the scope, and you can do this a couple of different ways. You can kind of look at different groups of people. So which people are we talking about? Are we talking about elementary school children? Are we talking about the elderly? Are we talking about adults? Who? Also, what kinds of food do we really want to call into question? Are we going to look at maybe non-organic food solely? Or are we going to look at fast food, people who consume a lot of fat? Are we going to look at, I don't know, processed foods versus unprocessed foods? There's lots of different ways we can really reel this in and make it quite specific. Another way we could look at this, we could kind of do a cause and effect relationship. So maybe we could talk about, well, what is the real issue? Why are people eating food that's unhealthy? What is the cause of that? And we could identify different causes. It could be that maybe people just aren't educated about healthy choices in food. It could be that people don't have the money to afford higher quality food that is healthier, etc. So you see, there are a lot of different ways that we could approach this if we're starting with something that is pretty big, pretty broad, like people eat food that is unhealthy. Another thing that I like to tell students to do, and I think this is a really neat idea, is to start with a generic topic, okay? You know that maybe you're given a topic and you know your teacher says you have to write about this, and you're not very excited about whatever this is, and you really want to make it your own so that it's not boring. Well, you can use this. Start with this generic topic and introduce a secondary topic to see if there is any kind of intersection between those two things. So what do I mean by that? Well, all right, let's go back to this idea of health food. Huge topic, lots we could say about it, but that's not a controlling idea. We don't have a direction yet. Well, let's say I'm kind of thinking about other sort of large topics and things that are interesting. I don't know. I have students create what we call an interest inventory, where they brainstorm for all different types of larger topics that are of interest, and I have them tuck it away so they can revisit it later and use it for just this purpose here. So let's say I had my student pick another topic that is of interest, and they grab self-esteem. So what you do now, you take this topic of health food, hold it up against this idea of self-esteem, and you think, do these things have any relationship? And if you take a moment to think about that, there might be some really interesting research material right there. Is there a correlation between people who eat healthy and their self-esteem, the way that they view themselves? And I mean, I haven't obviously done this research, but it seems very likely that you could find something, and it would be something, you'd be saying something that is unexpected, that perhaps your audience would never have previously heard. And that's just a really fun way to take a topic and make it your own. So put that one away for a later time. Now, the next topic I want to discuss is exactly where the thesis statement goes. So we talked about how to refine it, generally what it is, but like when you create one, where should you put it? And I ask my class usually, I say, students, what have your teachers told you in terms of where your thesis statement should go? And nearly everyone will say, well, it's supposed to go in the first paragraph, right? We've been taught thesis statements go in the first paragraph. Many of us are taught that the thesis statement should go even at the very end of the very first paragraph. Other students were taught to put it in the beginning, but the majority has been told thesis statements go last sentence of the first paragraph. And I ask them, well, is that the only place a thesis statement can go? And usually they think, well, yeah, that's what we've been told. But what I tell them, and what I want to tell you guys who are watching now, is that that's not the only place that a thesis needs to go. Generally, yes, that's where your thesis is going to go, because it is the most widely accepted and predictable kind of placement of a thesis, especially if you're working on an academic essay. But you have other options. And again, it just depends on what you're writing, how you want to approach your writing, who you're writing for, all of those rhetorical choices that you make as the author. So some alternate thesis strategies that you can potentially use. We also have the thesis question. So instead of, at the end of your first paragraph saying, making a direct statement that expresses, what the core idea of your essay is, you can kind of end on a question. So for example, you could say, is ADHD caused by instability in the home? I had a student once actually argue this and use a thesis question. I thought it was really interesting. Well, how does the thesis question work? It's kind of a helpful device if you want to have your reader's attention engaged. So, the person doesn't know, well, is there this correlation? Is there not? Where's the writer going? They're more apt to read on because they want to learn the answer to the question. This is also a great method if you want to show your reader the journey that you took in your research. I refer to this as cognitive process, but when the person who came up with this topic had this question for himself, he had this question in mind and he began to research it, and each new piece of information that he uncovered would open new doors, lead to new questions, and lead to further synthesis and greater understanding of the topic and what he ultimately believed about it. So when he wrote this paper, he was able to kind of take his readers on the same journey that he went through. So he would share, other questions that were raised along the way. He would uncover information sort of in the order that he found it. And basically what that does is that shows the reader how you arrived at your conclusions. It lets the reader see exactly what you did from beginning to end and in that order to arrive at the claim that you're making. And that's really helpful. It helps to establish your credibility as a writer because you're being very upfront with your readers. We also have the implicit thesis. This is an implied thesis. So what that means is that, there's no direct thesis statement. In other words, we're always told, oh, go and underline your thesis so that we can identify it, and that it should be this overt statement that we could find. Well, an implicit thesis is not that way. You'll see this in nearly all personal narratives. So if you find a story written by an author about his or her life, what you'll find is, in that introductory paragraph, there's not one sentence that we could underline and say, this is the main idea. What happens is the piece of writing is woven together so well, it's so cohesive that the reader is able to understand and articulate in his or her own words what the main idea is, but he or she can't find that one sentence that really sums it all up. And I tell students, you can try the implicit thesis, it definitely can work, but if you're new to writing, if you don't feel very comfortable with writing, you definitely don't want to try this strategy, because you have to be able to write really cohesively, and that means that you have to stay on point. You have to use a lot of your authorial voice or presence to show how the points or proofs that you're introducing feed back into your main idea. You need to have strong transitions. Just everything needs to work really well. So if that's something you would like to try, do make sure that you have all your ducks in a row in other areas of writing, so to speak. Let's go on. Now, another question I like to ask my students: when is the right time to compose the thesis? What were you guys taught? And again, overwhelmingly, what I'm told is that the thesis should be the first thing you do. And I'm talking the first thing you do before the research begins, before the draft begins, because that's the method that we were taught in high school predominantly. I remember myself, if I was going to write an essay in high school, I had to show my teacher what my thesis was before I would be permitted to continue with my research. Okay, now, is that problematic? I argue that it is a little bit problematic, because a lot of times as writers, we don't know what our thesis is going to be until the writing is done. Students really aren't taught this way, unfortunately, at the high school level, but what you'll learn as you kind of grow as a writer is that writing is a means of discovery. It's also a means of understanding a topic. You do your research, you put things together, but things really start to gel, and ideas, start to kind of merge together, and you see things in a new way when you actually sit down and write that draft. And maybe you didn't know what direction the draft was going to take, but it took a direction. So what I find is that students will sometimes write a thesis, they have it in mind, they go to the research, they get that done, they pump out the first draft, and then when they go back and look at the thesis, what has resulted from the draft is now kind of far off from what that initial statement was. So in my opinion, and there's really no right or wrong way to do this, it's all personal preference, but in my opinion, if you're going to have to go back and rewrite that statement anyways, why even bother doing it in the first place? I find that it's better to have a general idea of what your thesis is, but not actually write it out word for word, or start with a thesis question and see where that leads you. So those are different things that you can definitely try in your own writing to see if they are beneficial. A couple more slides I want to go over. We're almost done. What makes a thesis strong? Well, let's talk about that. Here are some qualities that a strong thesis will exhibit. Firstly, it's going to make some type of claim. Okay, and again, this goes back to the thing that I said earlier about students a lot of times will state what their subject is, but they don't ever indicate what the controlling idea is or what they're trying to say about the subject. You need to have that claim in there, or else you're not saying anything, you're not doing anything new or unique, from your own perspective. It also has to control the entire argument or essay. So it's a really important statement. It guides the entire piece of writing. It needs to be crafted so that wherever your essay is going, all points feed back to it. So if you're having issues with your thesis statement not aligning with your essay, it might mean that you need to go and revise the thesis somehow so that everything fits together. It also will provide a structure, or it might provide a structure. What I mean by that is sometimes, if you're going to make a claim, for example, I have my freshman students complete what I call an advertising analysis, and I have them compare and contrast similar advertisements, and I have them build a claim based on their observations. So, trying to think, for example, one might talk about how perfume companies use sex to sell. That might be the claim that they're making because they've reviewed 2 print ads for perfumes. But they have sort of like a 3-prong point system that they're going to go through, and they articulate that in the thesis. So for example, somebody might write, it's evident that perfume companies use sex to sell, which is evidenced in the use of, color, wording, and spatial layout. I don't know, I'm just kind of grabbing things. But you see, I have 3 main points, and you can imagine I'm going to then have at least 1 or 2 paragraphs about each of those 3 points appearing in my essay. So that thesis now is road mapping, or it's kind of giving my reader an indication of what is to come so that there aren't any surprises. It just helps to shore up any organizational issues. So that's what I'm talking about with the structure. The thesis also establishes a trust between the writer and the reader. When the reader hits the thesis and they read that for themselves the first time, the reader expects that you're going to stick to that thesis and you're going to argue or defend that point. So you obviously want to make sure that that statement does adequately cover whatever your paper is going to say. Next, a good thesis, of course, should also be supported by a strong introduction. And I generally will talk about introductions and the methods that students were taught in a future YouTube video. I could definitely go into different types of introductions that one could create. But for the most part, I know that as high school students, we're taught that we should start general and kind of funnel into our thesis statement. So go general, from general to specific. And that works. It's definitely a good way that you can get into your writing, but there are certainly other ways that you can also funnel into the writing. And one thing I warn against when using that method I just referenced, for the general to specific, is not to get too general. You want to start a little bit broad, but not so broad that it's kind of ridiculous. Like, for example, I think I had a student in the past who was trying to talk about the history of photography and made this like really sweeping generalization. And his essay started something like this, like, since the dawn of time, man has craved photography, or something like really ridiculous, because obviously photography hasn't existed forever, and he was trying to find like a nice broad way to funnel into the essay, and it was just way too broad. So be wary of that as well. Next, I have, and this is my last slide for you guys today, a good thesis checklist, okay? And this is a nice little tool that you can set aside and use in order to figure out if your thesis is working or not. In fact, I have my students take their first essay and use all the items on this checklist and actually write down responses so that they spend the time gauging whether or not they have hit their mark. So I definitely don't think that it's necessary for you to sit there and write out responses to these, but it's nice to have this checklist just as a kind of way that you can mentally go over your writing and see if it's working or if it needs to be improved in some areas. So let's go through this real quick. Firstly, does my thesis attempt to answer or explore a challenging intellectual question? Of course, you can answer that real quickly with a yes or a no. But the reason this question is here is because if you're saying no to this, then you might want to stop for a moment and ask yourself, well, why am I writing this essay? You know, imagine that you're at the college level or beyond at this point, and you definitely don't want to be writing on something that is too obvious or too easy, or that most people would already understand. You want to challenge yourself as a student, as a writer, to kind of delve into topics that are not frequently explored. So that's the first thing you want to do. Next, this kind of ties in. Would people be interested to discuss my point, or are they asking, so what? And definitely this is problematic, and it may not even, you may not even be able to tell this on your own, especially if you're very attached to your topic. This might be a question that you want to pose for a friend that maybe you could have sit down and read your essay or read the point of your essay. I've definitely in my lifetime read a lot of essays where I'm asking, so what? And that's a couple of different problems, or there's a couple of different causes for that. One could be that there's no controlling idea. So maybe there's a topic, but there's nothing really being done with the topic, or nothing specific said. The other problem could be that, kind of like in the first item on the checklist, that the thesis itself was just not really that startling, surprising, or, insightful. So I'm saying, so what for that purpose? Next, and this is stuff that we talked about, is the thesis too vague or too general? Should I focus on something more specific? And I talked about that binocular analogy. Definitely use the binoculars to either get closer to your subject or further away, depending on what resources are available and where your interests lie. Next, does the thesis deal with the issue at hand, or does it reflect more of my personal opinion or feelings? And I tell students it's important at this stage in the game to be able to share your personal feelings and opinions, but do so in a very careful way. Any kind of point of view that you have should be wholly backed by different types of evidence. It shouldn't just be, I feel this way because I feel this way, or this is how I was raised, or this is what I was taught. You need to be able to defend the assertions that you make or the things that you believe. So be careful not to fall into that trap. Next, does my thesis roadmap the organization of my essay? Is my cognitive process evident in its construction? These are, again, things we talked about throughout this PowerPoint. The road mapping comes when you point in your thesis sentence to different topics that will be discussed as part of your proofs. And the cognitive process, just to reiterate, that is this idea that the journey that you took as the researcher and the writer shines through in your writing, that you're taking your reader on the same exact journey that you went on in the whole process of collecting the information. Next, does my intro support my thesis, placing the topic in an appropriate context so that it's not too generic or too broad? And again, if you're finding that your introduction is a little bit too broad, then you are going to want to work on trying some different methods of introducing your subject. There are certainly many, many different methods that you can employ other than moving from general to specific. Lastly, is my language vivid and clear, and have I included all of the information in a concise way? Again, last point I'm going to make. The thesis statement is a really powerful tool. It drives your entire essay, so the wording of it is important. You don't want it to go on and on and on, be too convoluted or too weighed down with excess words, but you also expect it to do its job, kind of all these different things that we're going over right now. We want to make sure it possesses all of these attributes. Definitely isolate that sentence, look at it, figure out if there's any way that you can, abbreviate it somehow, or if more detail is necessary, but you definitely need to sit down and figure out just the right wording. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of insight into some strategies that you can employ to improve your thesis statements. And if you have any questions, please be sure to ask me personally or message me in the comments. I'm always happy to help. Thank you so much and have a great day.